We like to believe that money solves everything, that if we just had enough gold, enough silver, enough wealth piled high in our vaults, we would be invincible. We imagine ourselves buying security, power, immortality. But there's a darker truth that history whispers to those willing to listen. Money doesn't just corrupt. It hollows you out from the inside. It makes you fragile. It turns empires into addicts. This is the story of Spain in the 16th century. They didn't just get rich. They became the wealthiest nation on earth. They controlled more gold and silver than any kingdom in human history. They built the first global empire, stretching from Manila to Madrid, from Lima to Lisbon. The sun never set on Spanish soil. They had the best soldiers, the largest fleet, and God on their side. And then, in less than a century, they collapsed, not because they lost a war, not because they were invaded or conquered. They collapsed because they drowned in their own wealth. They learned a brutal lesson that still echoes today. That gold is not wealth. Gold is a drug. And Spain was about to overdose on the purest supply the world had ever seen. To understand how an empire dies of success, we need to travel to a frozen, barren mountain 13,000 feet above sea level. The year is 1545. The location is Potosí in what is now Bolivia. Before this moment, Spain was powerful but not economically dominant. They were warriors fresh from the Reconquista, hardened by centuries of religious warfare. They valued honor and the sword over commerce and the ledger. But in 1545, everything changed. A local man named Diego Gualpa was chasing a llama up the mountainside. He slipped. To catch himself, he grabbed at a bush. When the roots tore from the earth, he saw something that would reshape the global economy. Shimmering veins of pure silver running through the rock. He had discovered the Cerro Rico, the rich hill. It wasn't just a mine. The entire mountain was practically solid silver ore. When Spanish conquistadors arrived and saw what Gualpa had found, they couldn't believe their eyes. This was the El Dorado they had murdered and sailed for. This was the jackpot. Within a decade, Potosí transformed from a desolate wasteland into one of the largest cities on earth. By 1610, it had a population of over 160,000 people. That was larger than London, larger than Paris, larger than most European capitals. It was a city of greed, violence, and unimaginable extraction. The air was so thin at that altitude that newcomers gasped just walking down the street. But nobody came for the air, they came for the silver. And to get that silver out of the mountain, Spain needed labor. Massive amounts of labor. This is where the economic miracle becomes a human nightmare. The Spanish instituted the meta system. It was a forced labor draft that conscripted tens of thousands of indigenous men into the mines. These men worked in week-long shifts, deep underground. They didn't see the sun. They carried heavy sacks of ore up rickety wooden ladders in suffocating darkness. The mortality rate was catastrophic. Locals called it the mountain that eats men. It was said that if you squeezed a Spanish silver coin hard enough, blood would drip out. But digging the ore was only the beginning. The silver ore from Potosí was low grade. It had to be processed. And here Spain deployed a chemical revolution. They used the mercury amalgamation process. Workers would crush the rock, mix it with toxic mercury, and trample it with their bare feet. The mercury would bind to the silver, allowing it to be extracted. This process was industrial in scale. It allowed Spain to extract silver at rates never before seen in human history. The output was staggering. Between 1550 and 1800, the mines of Mexico and Peru produced 80% of the world's silver, and most of it flowed directly into the coffers of the Spanish crown. They melted it down, minted it into coins, and created the most famous currency in history, the piece of 8. This was the first global reserve currency. It was accepted in Shanghai, Seville, Boston, and Bombay. It was the dollar of the Renaissance. Twice a year, the treasure fleets would gather in Havana. These were massive convoys of galleons, heavily armed and riding low in the water. They were weighed down with billions of dollars in today's money. When they appeared on the horizon off the coast of Spain, church bells rang across the country. The king breathed a sigh of relief. The bankers rubbed their hands together. The party could continue for another year. Spain became the superpower of Europe overnight. They had the tercios, the feared infantry formations that were undefeated on the battlefield for over a century. They built cathedrals adorned with gold, leaf, and marble. King Charles V and later his son Philip II were the masters of the known world. They believed God had chosen Spain to lead humanity into a new age, but they made a fatal miscalculation. They looked at their mountains of silver and said, "We are rich." They didn't realize they were planting the seeds of their own destruction. They were confusing money with wealth. Money is just a medium of exchange. It's paper. It's metal. It's numbers on a ledger. Wealth is something else entirely. Wealth is the ability to produce things: food, clothes, tools, ships, technology. Spain had found infinite money, but they were about to stop producing wealth. The silver was acting like a narcotic. It provided a massive high, a feeling of invincibility. But deep inside the economy, the vital organs were shutting down. The farmers were leaving the fields. The blacksmiths were putting down their hammers. The weavers were abandoning their looms. Why work when the ships are coming? The addiction had begun. Imagine you're a shoemaker in Seville in the year 1550. Seville is the gateway to the Americas. It's the boomtown of the world. Suddenly the treasure fleet arrives. Sailors pour off the decks with pockets full of silver. The nobles have money. The soldiers have money. The merchants have money. Everyone wants to buy your shoes. So what do? You do what any rational businessman does. You raise your prices. Now imagine this happening to everyone, everywhere, all at once. The baker raises the price of bread. The landlord raises the rent. The weaver raises the price of cloth. This is what economic historians call the price revolution. It was the first major inflationary crisis in modern European history. As tons of silver flooded into Spain, the supply of money skyrocketed. But the supply of goods stayed the same. There were still the same number of shoes and loaves of bread. In previous centuries, prices in Europe had been remarkably stable. A loaf of bread cost roughly the same in 1500 as it did in 1400. But now prices in Spain rose by over 400% in less than a century. In a modern economy, we're used to 2 or 3% inflation. Central banks manage it. We plan around it. But in the medieval world, this was apocalyptic. It shattered the social contract. The poor were crushed. Wages did not keep pace with prices. A Spanish peasant found that even though there was more silver in the country than ever before, he could afford less food than his grandfather. Starvation returned to the countryside. not because there was no food, but because the money was broken. But the rich faced a different paradox, one that would destroy Spanish industry entirely. Because inflation made everything in Spain so expensive, Spanish goods became uncompetitive on the global market. Let's go back to our shoemaker. His shoes now cost 10 silver coins because he has to pay inflated prices for leather, thread, and food. But a shoemaker in France or England, where the silver hasn't flooded in yet, can make the same quality shoes for 2 silver coins. So what does the Spanish consumer do? He stops buying Spanish shoes. He buys imported French shoes. Spain became a funnel. The silver would arrive in Seville, be unloaded by the ton, and within weeks it would flow out of the country. It went to France, England, the Netherlands, and Italy to pay for imports. Spain was doing all the hard work, enslaving the miners, sailing the dangerous oceans, fighting off the pirates, only to hand the money over to their rivals to buy dinner. A famous saying emerged from this era: Spain is the mouth that receives the food, chewing it for the rest of Europe. Or, as a French observer mockingly put it, everything is dear in Spain except silver. This economic reality fundamentally changed Spanish culture. In England and the Netherlands, the merchant class was rising. They were building factories, shipyards, and textile mills. They were getting rich selling goods to the Spanish. But in Spain, working for a living became seen as shameful. The ideal Spaniard was not the merchant. It was the hidalgo, the son of something, a minor noble who owned land, did no manual labor, and lived off a government pension or rent. The influx of easy money created a society of consumers and bureaucrats. The dream was to get a government job near the silver tap, not to start a business. The famous Spanish literature of this period is full of these characters. Impoverished nobles starving to death but refusing to work because it's beneath their dignity. They would rather polish their armor and pretend to be rich than dirty their hands with trade. While the Dutch were inventing the stock market and the English were improving agricultural techniques, Spain was building churches and buying velvet capes. They were becoming hollow. The economy looked shiny and golden on the outside, adorned with the plunder of the Americas, but inside it was rotting. There was no production. There was no innovation. There was only the wait for the next fleet. And this reliance on the fleet created a terrifying vulnerability. The entire stability of the empire depended on wooden ships crossing an ocean full of storms and enemies. If the wind didn't blow, the king couldn't eat. And the king had a very large appetite. King Philip II was the most powerful man on earth. He sat in his massive, gloomy palace, El Escorial, surrounded by monks and mountains of paperwork. He micromanaged an empire that spanned the globe. He ruled Spain, Portugal, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, the Philippines, and vast territories in the Americas. He was the planet king. But holding the planet is expensive. Philip saw himself not just as a monarch, but as the sword of God. He believed it was his divine duty to defend Catholicism against the Protestant Reformation and the Ottoman Turks. This meant he had to fight everyone, everywhere, all the time. And wars are not cheap. He fought the Ottoman Turks in the Mediterranean. The climax was the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. It was the largest naval engagement since antiquity. Spain won. But it cost a fortune. He fought the French for supremacy in Italy. But his biggest bleeding wound was the Netherlands. The Netherlands was a Spanish possession, but it was also the birthplace of capitalism and Protestantism. The Dutch rebelled in 1568. Philip sent the army of Flanders to crush them. This began the 80 Years' War. It was a logistical nightmare. To get soldiers to the Netherlands, Spain had to march them along the Spanish road from Italy through the Alps. They had to pay, feed, and clothe 70,000 men, thousands of miles from home for decades. And because Spanish industry had been hollowed out by inflation, they couldn't even make their own weapons. Spain had to buy gunpowder and cannons from foreign merchants, sometimes even from the Dutch themselves. The silver from Potosí was literally funding Spain's enemies. Then came the obsession with England. Queen Elizabeth I was a Protestant heretic in Philip's eyes, and her privaters, men like Francis Drake, were stealing his treasure ships. In 1588, Philip made the ultimate gamble. He launched the Spanish Armada, 130 ships, 30,000 men, thousands of cannons. It was the most expensive naval force ever assembled in human history. The cost was astronomical. To pay for it, Philip didn't use the silver he had. He used the silver he hoped to get. This brings us to the dark engine of Spanish finance, the agentos. The agentos were short-term, high-interest loans provided by German and Genoese bankers, families like the Fuggers and the Walsers. Philip II was essentially taking out payday loans on an imperial scale. He would go to the bankers and say, "Lend me 5 million ducats now to build the Armada. I'll pay you back when the treasure fleet arrives in 6 months." The bankers, seeing the massive shipments of gold arriving year after year, agreed. They charged 10, 20, sometimes 40% interest. But the Armada was a disaster. It wasn't defeated by a superior navy. It was defeated by bad weather, poor coordination, and rigid tactics. Storms smashed the Spanish fleet against the rocks of Scotland and Ireland. Half the fleet sank. Thousands of sailors drowned. When the news reached Philip, he reportedly said, "I sent my ships to fight against men, not against the winds and waves of God." But the bankers didn't care about God's winds. They wanted their money. The ships were at the bottom of the ocean. The cannons were rusting in salt water. The investment was gone. But the debt remained, and the interest was ticking. The resource curse had now evolved into a debt trap. By the 1570s, the interest payments on the national debt were larger than the entire tax revenue of the Spanish Empire. Think about that. Every penny the government collected in taxes, plus every ounce of silver that arrived from the Americas, was not enough to pay even the interest on the loans. They weren't paying down the principal. They were just treading water. The king was trapped on a treadmill. He had to borrow more money just to pay off the old money. He mortgaged the future of Spain for generations. He sold the rights to collect taxes. He sold noble titles. He squeezed the peasantry until they had nothing left. The bankers in Genoa effectively owned the Spanish Empire. The gold would arrive in Seville, be immediately transferred to the ledgers of Italian financiers. Spain was just a shipping company for its creditors, and the system was stretched to the breaking point. All it would take was one bad year, one hurricane sinking a fleet, one pirate raid, and the house of cards would collapse. We tend to think of sovereign default as a modern phenomenon. We think of Greece or Argentina or Venezuela. But Philip II of Spain was the father of the sovereign default. He did it bigger and louder than anyone else in history. The breaking point came in 1557. The wars in France and the Netherlands had drained the treasury. The treasure fleet was delayed. The bankers refused to lend any more. Philip II stood before his court and issued a royal decree. He declared that Spain was suspending all payments to its creditors. He looked at the most powerful bankers in Europe and said, "I'm not paying you." It was a financial earthquake. In Antwerp and Genoa, banks collapsed overnight. Wealthy families lost everything. The credit markets of Europe froze. It was the 16th century equivalent of the 2008 financial crisis, but caused by one man, one signature. But here's the tragedy. It didn't stop the spending. It just made borrowing more expensive. Because Spain was addicted to war and addicted to imports, they had to keep borrowing. After the default, the bankers eventually came back. But now they charged even higher interest rates to account for the risk. The debt spiral accelerated. Spain defaulted again in 1575, and again in 1596, and again in 1607, 1627, and 1647. It became a generational cycle. Borrow, spend, crash, default. Borrow, spend, crash, default. The impact on the Spanish people was horrific. When the king couldn't pay his soldiers, the soldiers mutinied. In 1576, unpaid Spanish troops sacked the city of Antwerp, their own city. They burned it to the ground in an orgy of violence known as the Spanish Fury. This act destroyed the financial center of Northern Europe. It pushed the Dutch to fight even harder for independence. Back home in Spain, the government tried a desperate new measure. Since all the silver was flowing out to foreign bankers, there was no money left for daily commerce. So the crown began to debase the currency. They stopped minting silver coins for the public. They started minting coins made of pure copper called vellon. It was junk money. It had no intrinsic value. The king would mint billions of these copper coins and force the people to accept them at the value of silver. It was a hidden tax. The result, predictably, was hyperinflation on top of the silver inflation. Prices fluctuated wildly. People began hoarding silver and refusing to accept copper. The economy bifurcated. The rich and the government dealt in silver. The poor were left trading worthless copper tokens. The middle class was wiped out. Trust in the currency evaporated. Markets seized up. By the mid-1600s, the Spanish century was over. The mines of Potosí began to dry up. The veins ran thin.